Okay, hi, it's me, Sam, aka Rangaku, back for another video. And today we're going to be talking about two of my favorite subjects, and that is sports and international geopolitics. And today we're going to be talking about the mix between those two, because I am an American who is very proud of being American always. Um, and so today, basically, I'm going to be exploring my own views on who I support in international sports, who most people support based on data, as well as anecdotal stuff from my friends. Okay, so this idea came from, well, it originally came from like the 4th of July in Canada Day, which as of time of recording was like a month ago. Whoops. Um, as well as all the international tournaments that have happened in men's and women's sports over the last few summers, specifically in regards to basketball and soccer or football, as I will be calling it from here on out. Um, those are going to be the two main sports that I'm going to be referring to because those are the two sports I care about, and they're two of the most popular sports in the world, especially football in terms of international sports. I think it's a great comparison to the general American sports, which I'm going to be mostly referring to basketball to represent that. So to give some context to like the American sports scene, because we're going to be comparing it a lot to football, there isn't really an international game. Like there is, like in basketball, there is FIBA, there's the World Cup and stuff, but relative to football, people don't really care about it. It's not something that's that important. The Olympics is really the only avenue that we really see this actually being a relevant part of international sports. I think in baseball, like there's the World Series, like the International World Series, which I think Japan won. The most popular American sport, the NFL, doesn't like there's no international game for that. Hockey does. They recently like did the Four Nations or something for the All-Star break. But relative to football, there isn't really an international sport. Like there isn't tournaments or competitions that people highly value on a regular basis. And so I think because that doesn't exist, Americans don't really care that much about international sports and don't really think about it again outside of the Olympics because that's what our country has decided to really value. And for good reason. I mean, Americans quite good at the Olympics. I think they have the most gold medals ever, I think. Um, and so that's just not a cultural thing, is to root for your sports the way, say, a random Albanian person would love for their Albanian football team to go and win, which would be hard to do because it's Albania, but whatever. Um, and I think you see this materializes in a few different ways. Like, for example, the most popular soccer or football team in the United States for a national team is Mexico. It's not the United States. And my dad knows this, and he's like, I would never go. I don't really want to see America play in the U.S. ever because I know it would basically be a Mexico home game if the U.S. and Mexico were playing. And I think that's really interesting. And so I did a little research into trying to understand why, and that kind of led me onto part of why I have all these questions about um, you know, what it means to be an American in sports and why root for my team and my country. So the biggest thing that I could think of is a lot of people tend to root for either the team that they like are from, like the country they're from, or ethnicity. And so in America at least, Hispanic and specifically Mexican people have a lot of cultural heritage and are usually from like one specific country, like Mexico or El Salvador or something versus white or black Americans who don't really have a connection to, say, like one country. And I think this, like, specific to the white mutt identity, I think that's an important thing that I'll talk about later in the video, where you're essentially a whole bunch of random European countries mixed into one person because your family has been in America for so many generations that there's been a bit of mixing. And so it's not like, at least for me, I'm a, like my family's been in America for a very long time, so I don't have like one country, say like a Mexican immigrant or like second gen Mexican immigrant who has roots to Mexico and can just root for the Mexican team because their family's from there, their parents are from there, their grandparents are from there, right? I don't have anything like that. And a lot of white Americans don't have that because they've been here longer. Now, that's not to say that all Mexican people are recent immigrants or have no, nuanced cultural background. but generally speaking, right? And then for Black Americans, this is a whole nother thing. Um, Obviously, a lot of Black Americans came from the time of slavery, in which, they were stolen from where they're from, their families from, and there weren't really records kept. The modern understanding of country wasn't necessarily the same as it was now in Africa, and so a lot of people don't know where they're from, um, and don't have ties to one specific country. Again, that's a bit of a generalization. There are certainly Black Americans who are from, let's say, one specific country like Nigeria or something. Maybe they're more recent immigrants, or they've just done the research and have been lucky enough to have a history that is traceable. And so then maybe they have more of a cultural connection to, say, one of their countries of where they're from. So yeah, again, this will be like kind of a deep dive into from the white American perspective, one that's often overlooked in the media, right? Who would you root for, say, in a competition that doesn't feature America, or a competition where America has been knocked out? I think that's a kind of an interesting question, and one that I think about a lot. I think, there's the Euros last year in men's football. There's the women's Euros this year, which I got to go to. Footage editor Sam. Wow. Um, there's a bunch of basketball tournaments. There's the World Cup next summer. This is a question that I've been thinking about a lot and have tried to understand what the thought process is for a lot of people and where they would go to. And so, doing some research, I found this really cool article by For Soccer that I think sums up a lot of my research in a cool way. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit right now. Um, so this first chart that I'm going to talk about is essentially why people root for the teams that they do. Generally, it's, as you can see, where they're from. That's only 50% though. That's a bit interesting for me. I would have thought it would have been a lot higher. Um, and also, I don't know if I agree with or I'm skeptical rather, that the second option is so high. I would have thought that would have been much lower, and that the third option would be more higher. Granted, that's only like 1%. That's not actually that significant, but from my anecdotal stuff that I'll get into later, a lot of people tend to root for either the country that they're born in, the country that they're ethnically associated with, or just a country that they like or have a player that they like and are rooting them for that. Yeah, and I think for myself, the third one down, I live or I previously lived in that country is especially important to me. As you can see, I'm wearing a Canadian national team kit. I have root for the Canadian national team, specifically in football, not in other sports as well, but if like the U.S. men's national team was playing the Canadian national team in football, I would root for Canada. And that's, I think, the only sport where I would rather Canada win, which is I'll get into that more later. But the idea of living in a country, I think, is really important. And as someone who wants to live in a lot of different countries other than just America, because America's interesting, um, I think I value that one a lot. And the teams that I root for generally are ones that I have or will live in the future. And so that's something that personally I would have had higher up in terms of the why I would root for a team. I also thought it was funny that there was a I choose countries at random. I don't know anyone who's done that. I think that's kind of funny, but we'll move on to the next one. This I thought was interesting, and I agree anecdotally and personally on this from my own self-thinking and asking of my friends of that most people have one national team that they really care about, but kind of care about a few others. I think this is pretty true for most people. I think that one favorite team is usually the country they're born in. Again, unless you have one country that you're particularly ethnically, um, you know, close to. So, for example, if you are a Mexican American, the one favorite team is likely Mexico. If you're American or white American, excuse me, your favorite team is probably the United States, but maybe you care about like maybe you're part Finnish or something, so you kind of like the Finnish national team. I don't know. I also like how there's a don't root or watch. That's interesting. So another article I saw was talking about how if you weren't rooting for America, what would your other favorite teams be? And specifically for football in the last few World Cups, it's been teams like Germany or Brazil or Argentina or even like a Portugal. Teams that have, the best players in the world or just fun or exciting are the favorites. Um, I think it's easy for, say, like a casual fan who doesn't necessarily know a lot about smaller nations and their football players to care about, the biggest teams in the world. I think that makes sense. So I'm going to talk about some more anecdotal stuff here, based on my own experiences as well as. So I asked some of my Canadian friends, even though this is a video more so meant from the American perspective, I still think Canada's similar enough, from a North American cultural perspective. Um, Basically, in terms of what team they would root for in the recent European competition. So in Canada, my friends were more football fans, so I asked them who they would root for in the Euros. And my American friends, shockingly, were not big football fans. So for the upcoming Eurobasket tournament, I asked who they would be rooting for. And so in Canada, I had a few friends. One of them, he's Colombian, and so, or he's ethnically Colombian, but he is a Canadian citizen. He roots for those two teams pretty equally, but I think he does edge out, Canada edges out a little bit more. Um, Another one of my friends, he's mixed. He's half white, half Indian. He rooted for England in the Euros, and that was largely because of a certain player that I don't particularly like. Um, Another one of my friends, he's also Asian. He's Cantonese. He also rooted for England. That's because he's a Manchester United fan and just liked a lot of the players on that team because of they were on United. Another one of my friends is Indian and he just hated on France. So a bit of a mixed bag there. And I compare that to my American friends and who they would root for in basketball, because naturally they're not football fans, and who they're rooting for in this upcoming Eurobasket tournament, or just in international basketball, more broadly. And one of my friends, he roots for his ethnicity, so Ireland and then Czechia. But those aren't in the tournament, so he's rooting for Greece because Giannis. Another of my friends is Jewish, so he's rooting for Israel. Another one is Finnish, and so he's rooting for Finland. And then there's my brother, who's similar ethnically wise to me, but not the same. He was rooting for Serbia, especially against the U.S. in what was my most patriotic moment, because he's a Denver Nuggets fan, and so he likes Nikola Jokic. And so all these guys are white too, which I think is interesting, because all of them rooted for ethnicities that they have some connection to, but not a super close one to. Or in the case of my brother, just a player he liked. Then, like for myself, um, I root for America in basketball specifically because there's just so much to be proud of. I feel like it feels like an all-star game. Like it's the best players in the world all playing together. It's awesome, including my favorite players in the world like Damian Lillard or LeBron. And it makes me feel really patriotic to see all of them suit up together, and to dominate, uh, or at least historically dominate everyone else in basketball. For football, it's a little bit different for me. So, around the time that I decided that I wanted to move to Canada, which I'm no longer doing now, but still, I got into football as well. And so that was around the time of the 2022 World Cup. I got to go to that. I got to see Canada live. I also got to see the US live, which was actually a very cool, patriotic moment. We were chanting, "It's called soccer." It was against England, which is actually very fun. But seeing Canada live, that I got really into the team then, um, because I thought, that's where I'm going to be living the rest of my life. That's the team that I want to support, going forward. Um, I'd been watching the United States in basketball for much longer. I'd been watching basketball longer as a whole, while I was still in America, and so I didn't really have. I still had some aspirations of, living in other countries, but not as concrete. And so I think that's part of why those are a bit split in my head. Generally, in any other sport or in the Olympics, let's say, I would root for America and Canada. It kind of depends on the players or what sport it is exactly, who's better, who's not, but generally either one of those two teams. So, to kind of conclude from my research, as well as asking my friends, as well as thinking internally, for a white American, if you're rooting for a team outside of your country, let's let the US, you generally will go for what you're mostly ethnically from, but you probably don't have a super close attachment to that country than, say, a Hispanic immigrant on average. Um, so your support will still likely be the US first because that's a country you associate more strongly towards. But in the case that it doesn't work, let's say you root for another team. for example, my dad, we are Dutch. Our last name is Dutch, and so my dad likes to root for the Netherlands, after the United States. Um, but that's not necessarily always the case. Like my brother, who in basketball cares a lot more about players. He likes Nikola Jokic, and so he likes Serbia. And so after ethnicity, it goes to if you have some attachment to that country. So for myself in Canada, I think that's a big one. I also want to live in Australia, and so I like to root for Australia in a lot of sports. Um, then after that, it goes into players. So like my brother, who likes Nikola Jokic, likes to root for Serbia in basketball. Um, so yeah, it's kind of the home country, which is the U.S., ethnicity, which is not necessarily as close to compared to other minorities, or just minorities in general. Um, then the next one then is ethnicity, which isn't as strong as a lot of uh, you know people of color would have their connections to, I guess, other than black people who may not know where they're from because of systemic racism. And then after that, you would go into if you have association with that country that, or you just like them for whatever reason, like me, and then it's usually a player that you like or a team that you like, the vibes, the players, something like that. And I think that's kind of interesting. If you're maybe a more recent immigrant or you're just more aware, culturally aware of where you're from, or like you're second generation immigrant, um, maybe then you root for where your parents or grandparents or whoever are from, um, which is again why Mexico is so popular in the United States. Um, I think there's people walking loudly, but now they're gone. Okay, it's fine. Okay, sorry if you hear them. I am recording this outside, if you could not tell. Um, and then again, I talked about a bit the Black experience. Now, I'm obviously no expert, but I was listening to a really good podcast by Vox, about this topic, specific to more around the 4th of July and the Black experience with American patriotism. Um, they had some really cool articles, including how there was a protest that featured a Betsy Ross flag. Um, I forget what the protest was. I think it was a No Kings protest, and they had a Betsy Ross flag, um, which depending on the context, I could, be worried that it's meant to be more like a "don't tread on me," like America used to be this kind of way, like a rednecky conservative way. But it wasn't. It was this is what America was founded on, of, the basis of equality, as well as, it was a revolutionary time. The Betsy Ross flag was arguably the original flag of the United States and came out of the American Revolution. And so people want to reclaim that, Black Americans specifically want to reclaim that as, let's get America back into a revolutionary time right now. And I think that's a really interesting way to view it. And I think there's been a growing sense of patriotism in the younger generations of the last, 6 months or so, 6, 7 months or so, usually really after Donald Trump, and kind of a to combat that, there's been a growing sense of liberals or, Democrats, left-leaners who are starting to become more patriotic of America in a more visionary way, in like America could be such a great country, and it has done a lot of amazing things. It's also done a lot of terrible things. Let's acknowledge those, let's try to fix those, and let's try to move forward. And I think that makes me very patriotic. The fact that there's a growing sense of, let's fly the American flag, not in a redneck MAGA way, but in a this is where I'm from. I'm proud of it, but let's make it even better. And I think that's a similar thing to like the United States national team, which I kind of talked about earlier, of how, America has the tools, they have the players, they have the people, um, to go out and be the best country in the world at soccer or football. But there's infrastructure issues, there's a lot of, cultural differences of why that doesn't happen, but it could be. And that potential and that almost hope, I think, makes me feel a bit patriotic. And I think that's really cool and something that um, I'm really happy for, myself and my patriotism with my country, both in sports and outside of it. I think that's a really cool, interesting way of how, you know, the left is trying to kind of reclaim American patriotism and rebrand it as, let's acknowledge the past and the terrible things that have happened and say America could be so much better. Let's make it better. And I want to be part of that process, and I want to be proud to be a part of that process. And that, that could apply to politics and the government, or sports and the national team. And that's something I can get really behind. And I think I found this for myself, at least personally, is that I'm proud of what I'm proud of. And that sounds a bit dumb, but there's some aspects of America that make me really patriotic. We've invented so many amazing things, like the fact that the YouTube is an American invention. The internet's, half of the things that I'm using to record this video, I think, is an American invention. That's really cool. Um, Also, I acknowledge as a history nerd that like America's done a lot of terrible things. Like I think I've thought about this. I think America's like maybe the second worst country in terms of like historical things, like bad things that have been done. England's number one, by the way, in my opinion. But like America's done a lot of really bad things, and I know that, and that's not good, and that doesn't make me patriotic, obviously. Um, but trying to move forward from that and like the ideas that America are founded on of equality, even though in practice that doesn't exist. I think that's at least a hopeful start and like a good framework to position yourself with, even if we don't always follow through on it. Um, and like I found that, you know, like even in the thumbnail, right? Like I'm proud that LeBron is an American citizen. Seeing him fly the flag and being captain, like that Captain Lamerica on the boat, like that was awesome for me. Like that was a cool, like prideful experience for me. Seeing Christian Pulisic do a little Trump dance, that's a part of America that I'm not proud of. And I think that's just what it is to be an American and to be proud of it, is that there's some things that you're proud of and some things that you're just not. And then you see that in sports, which I think is a great avenue to represent patriotism. But you also see that just in politics in general. You know, I'm proud of a lot of cool I'm trying to think actually, what am I proud of politically that America's done? I don't know. There's a lot of bad things that America has done politically. But again, like inventions and stuff, that is a very cool American thing. American culture and media, Hollywood, all these things. That is something that it's somewhat, problematic in some ways, but generally I think that's a really cool thing that I'm proud of. Um, and like with the women's national team, right? I like them. They're cool. In part because they win a bit more, but also because they symbolize something cool, like trying to have women's equality and uplift women. That's something I can get behind. And um, so that aspect I really value. Kind of going on from like I'm proud of what I'm proud of. Being a white mutt, which is, ethnically I'm a whole bunch of different things, right? I'm like I think like a quarter Scottish, a quarter German, and a quarter Norwegian, and then a whole bunch of other things beyond that. And so, sorry if you can hear the plane, by the way. Um, I feel like because I don't have one country that I can really strongly associate with, other than let's say like America, but I mean like ethnically wise, and American ethnic, like I'm not Native American, I'm not indigenous, so I'm not, I don't have ethnic roots necessarily to my home country. I don't have a country that, say, like, again, Mexico or Mexican fans have. Like, I don't have a country like that. I have like eight that I can like kind of support or kind of claim. And that is kind of fun because that means I get to kind of pick and choose. And that is like that I've had some fun with. And that, this is usually if, my big three of the US, Canada, and Australia are knocked out or whatever, not in that tournament, then I get some fun, right? Because now we can kind of claim a lot of different teams. Like in the Euros, I have a reasonable, right, which is a whole, I could debate whether or not that's a valid thought or whatever. But, you know, I have some stake to say, I can root for basically half of all Euro teams. I think I went through and was like, yeah, either I am from this country ethnically wise to some part, or maybe, I've spent a lot of time in this country or their media, or I have friends from this country that I really, connect with or something. Um, or just maybe some, vague association, right? But I can kind of pick and choose as I will. So let's say, the Netherlands is having a really good Euros tournament, or Germany is, I may be a little more proud of my German or Dutch side. Um, but maybe in basketball, the Netherlands is not very good. But who's a good that I'm ethnically a part of? Belgium? I don't even know. Yeah, there's not many. I've been trying to think for a few like 30 seconds. I can't think of anyone that I like is good basketball wise. I guess, yeah, I think I'm a bit Belgian and like yeah, there's not many. I've been trying to think for a few like 30 seconds. I can't think of anyone that I like is good basketball wise. I guess, yeah, I think I'm a bit Belgian and like they just won the women's Euros, but like I'm like barely Belgian, so like I can't even really lift that. So, you know, I think it's a kind of a funny game to play that, but um, yeah, it's interesting in getting able to pick and choose a little bit as I want, um, based on who's winning, what players I like, stuff like that. But then the flip side of that is I also never fully feel a part of those countries, right? It's like when I was living in Germany, I wore a Germany kit to the office one day, and all of them were like, I mean, you're not German. Like, why? Not necessarily why would you wear that, but like it was a bit of you're not one of us. And I'm not. I lived in the country for a bit. I'm part German and like ethnically, and I speak a little bit of German. So I definitely have some connection to the country, but ultimately I'm not German. And so while I can root for the team a little bit, it's not going to feel, Germany won the World Cup in basketball a few years ago. That, I didn't like break down in tears that my country had won because that wasn't my country. It was one of my countries. And so it was kind of cool. I would have rather like the US or Canada had won or even Australia, but I could also lift that and say, part of my ancestry, the country of my ancestry won the basketball World Cup. So like that's kind of cool, but it it's still a bit of a what's the word? Imposter syndrome a little bit, which is also just I think all of this is all just shockingly a little too much, thinking. I don't think anyone really cares who you root for that much. I think, especially if you're a small country and someone's, has a genuine association and love for your country, I think most people are like, nice. Also, like, you're not from my country, but I'm happy you're rooting for us. Some people maybe not think that and say, you weren't born here, you're not from here. This isn't your country. Root for your country, not mine. But ultimately, it's not that deep. Root for who you want to root for. I'm gonna make a whole video soon about Eurobasket and who you should be rooting for. And I think that kind of concludes my video. I don't really think I have anything more else to say on this topic as of now. But yeah, leave in the comment thing below who you would be rooting for in international sports and who you do root for if you watch, uh, other than say your home country. Um, but yeah, I love you guys. Bye.